So let me just start off, say a few words. The Citizens Research Council, as I hope you are all aware, started in 1916 as a Detroit-based organization and eventually grew into a statewide organization and staked its claim over 100 years as being a nonpartisan, independent source of public policy analysis. So on the advent of our 100th anniversary this year, April 13th, just almost 2 months ago now, the day we opened our doors, we published our book on the 100 years and how we've made a difference in Michigan over this time, and seemed to fit well with the mission of this organization to think about how political history has evolved in Michigan. So they asked us to join them here. We have today Earl Ryan, who is President Emeritus of the Citizens Research Council and the author of the book. And Earl's going to give talk a little bit about the early years of the organization, from birth until it became a statewide organization, I think. And then we're going to have a panel join us to give some perspective on some of the more recent history, the second half of those 100 years. So Earl has been with the Citizens Research Council off and on over a number of years, took time out to be with the state as a state employee, and then took off for Louisiana and then Indiana, and eventually came home and ran the Citizens Research Council until his retirement just a few years ago. When we have the panel join us, we're going to have Wanger, who was a CONCON delegate. The last time we were able to convince enough people that our state government was so broke that we need to reinvent it. And I look forward to his comments on how this, how the organization, how the information of the Citizens Research Council was an asset to him. We also have John Lindstrom from Gongwer, who has watched state and local policy being developed for many years, and during that time has had a very friendly relationship with the Citizens Research Council, so we're thankful for him being able to join us. And we also have Cleary, who is now the director, I think, of the House Fiscal Agency. And Marianne and I have had a little similar in the past, her joining House Fiscal about the same time I joined the Citizens Research Council. So we're very thankful that each of them will be able to join us. Earl's going to do his thing first, and then when we get to that part, we'll ask everybody to join him at the table. So I want to mention before I step down, we have a few Citizens Research Council staff members with us. Bob Schneider, who is our Director of State Affairs, put your hand up so everyone knows, and over here Othniel Quiche, who is doing a lot of our local government research. So we'll be around afterwards and love to hear your perspectives and any thoughts. So let me get out of the way and turn this over to Earl.
Thank you, Eric. Almost no matter how familiar you are with the Citizens Research Council or how familiar you think you are, if I were to tell you that CRC can trace its roots back to an organization called the Association for the Improving the Condition of the Poor in early 20th century New York City, I think you'd probably demand an explanation. Well, here's that explanation. One of the many pieces of the mosaic known as the Progressive Era was something called the social gospel, which held that good works were necessary for salvation. And by good works, these folks didn't mean rolling cancer bandages or serving in soup kitchens. They had much grander goals for salvation, availability of pure milk, combating alcoholism, improving the schools for poor children, bringing sanitation to tenements, and generally ridding the burgeoning cities of the ills attendant to unprecedented immigration. Perhaps the most important organization associated with the social gospel movement was one in New York City, headed in the late 1890s and early 1900s by Robert Fulton, yes, the same name as the guy who invented the steamboat in the early 19th century. Cutting was immensely wealthy, hobnobbing with the Rockefellers, the Carnegies, the Harrimans, and the Vanderbilts. And the organization he headed was the Association for Improving the Condition of the Poor. It had been established in part as a reaction to the influx of Irish Catholics who were viewed as targets of reform by many wealthy Protestant New Yorkers. By the early 1900s, it became clear that the agenda of the reformers was being frustrated by corrupt, inefficient government, which was the government being responsible for public health, education, and infrastructure, all key to the reformers' goals. The first strategy chosen was to elect a mayor who would champion their reforms. Their candidate was Columbia President Seth Low, who, with the support of Cutting's Citizens Union and the Republican Party and even Mark Twain, was elected mayor of New York City in 1901. Low was not ineffective and succeeded in establishing a civil service system in New York, but he was not a skilled campaigner, and he was defeated for re-election by the experienced political types in Tammany Hall after only 2 years in office. It became clear to Cutting and his friends that a new strategy was needed if the reformers were going to be successful. It happens that at that time, the secretary of the Association for Improving the Condition of the Poor was a young financial analyst, William H. Allen, who suggested to Cutting that a more successful long-term strategy would include research into the structure and operation of city government, which would then be made available to citizens and the press, creating a fact-based foundation for bringing efficiency and accountability to New York City government. Cutting was convinced, and in 1906 he created the Bureau of City Betterment with Allen as its executive. In 1907 it was renamed the Bureau of Municipal Research to better reflect its true function, and together with Henry Bruere and Frederick Cleveland, the Bureau under Allen began to produce unassailable studies of maladministration in New York City. Tammany Hall was rocked. Cutting's rich friends took notice and support began to flow to the organization. The governmental research movement had been launched. A part of the new bureau was the National Training School for Public Service, which aimed at teaching the principles of public administration to young interns who would go into government and reform it from within. One of the brighter stars of the early interns was a PhD from the University of Illinois by the name of Lent D. Upson, who arrived in 1911. The New York Bureau staff was so impressed by Upson that they recommended him to John Patterson, who was the head of National Cash Register in Dayton, and he was forming a municipal research bureau along the lines of the New York organization. And Upson went to Dayton in 1912 and was soon successful in his advocacy of a city manager form of government for the city. And the next year, he successfully managed the recovery effort following the Great Dayton Flood of 1913. Upson returned to New York briefly in 1914, but Patterson had been so impressed that he persuaded him to return to Dayton as Secretary of National Cash Register. In late 1915, Cutting and Cleveland of the New York Bureau attended a lunch in Detroit hosted by Emory Clark, who was the head of the first, and I love this name, the first and old National Bank of Detroit. And it was also attended by Otto Kirchner, Michigan Attorney General in the 1880s, and then Vice President of the German American Savings Bank. Cutting was trying to persuade Clark to help develop Detroit financial support of a survey of federal spending in the mode of the New York Bureau's analysis of New York spending. Clark and Kirchner demurred on that project, but were so taken with the idea of a governmental research organization that they decided to support one for Detroit. Kirchner, who had taught municipal law at the University of Michigan, and was, like Cutting, a member of the social gospel movement, agreed to head the effort. And by the way, although Cutting was unsuccessful in Detroit in getting his support of a national research agency, he found funding elsewhere and soon formed the Institute for Governmental Research, which in 1927 became a key element in the creation of the Brookings Institution. By the next spring, Clark and Kirchner, along with Ralph Stone, head of Detroit Trust, and Sidney T. Miller of Miller Canfield, had organized a board of directors, extracted pledges of financial support sufficient to operate a small staff, and found a suite of offices at 100 Griswold in Detroit. On March 22, 1916, the day after a record springtime snowstorm in Detroit, they filed the Articles of Association for the Detroit Bureau of Governmental Research, whose object was to secure efficiency and economy in government by all lawful means except promoting election or appointment to public office. Now all they needed was someone to run the new organization, and they could not have made a better choice. There is no record of such a discussion, but at some point, Cutting and Cleveland must have mentioned the name of their star intern, Len Upson, to Clark and Kirchner, because Upson was immediately contacted with the offer to run the new bureau. Now, you'll recall that Upson was at the National Cash Register at the time, undoubtedly making more money than he ever would in governmental research, but the thought of heading a governmental research organization in America's fastest growing big city was more than he could resist. His parting words to his boss, John Patterson, were, "I can't for the life of me get interested in cash registers." So, on April 13th, 1916, 29-year-old Lent Dayton Upson took charge of the Detroit Bureau of Governmental Research. Upson had all the tools that were needed to become a giant in his field. He was normally, as one associate told me, the smartest person in the room, but he softened his intellect with a wry, slightly sarcastic sense of humor that ingratiated himself with board members, civic leaders, public officials, staff members, and perhaps most importantly to him, a multitude of grateful students. Known affectionately by his friends and associates simply as Up, he was a pioneering researcher and communicator. He understood the difficulties of explaining the issues to those who are not engaged in the day-to-day study of public affairs and strove to make the Bureau analyses clear and accessible. From the beginning, Upson was a philosopher of governmental research, even at the age of 28, founding the Governmental Research Association, the movement's national association, to help develop standards of research and to foster the spread of the profession. Above all, Upson was a teacher, for many years conducting seminars at the University of Michigan and later developing a long-term relation with Wayne University. He was a mentor, whether you were a graduate student or an employee. He was demanding but supportive, had words of wisdom appropriate to each problem or occasion. For example, and this one ought to be engraved everywhere, memorize one axiom, challenge every fact and every conclusion, both yours and the other fellows, and then yours again. Then you're on your way to becoming a good researcher. Or, rules are excellent substitutes for thinking and for the stamina necessary to make decisions. And many of those he had mentored went on to distinguished careers, both in governmental research and in government itself, and he never tired of acknowledging their achievements. Upson had a nuanced stance toward government. He was an agnostic regarding the size of government, regarding that as a valid political decision, preferring to focus his attention on how government might better perform whatever tasks it chose to do. And while he recognized that the job of governmental research was to provide sometimes uncomfortable analysis of governmental processes and policies, he was also aware that most governmental officials were not corrupt or incompetent and would operate efficiently and effectively if given the tools. And he was particularly impatient with those who complained about government without bothering to inform themselves regarding the issue. Today, his words appear on the home page of the Citizens Research Council. The right to criticize government is also an obligation to know what you're talking about. Upson went to work immediately, assembling a first-rate staff and launching a research program that included recommending central purchasing for the city, reducing the size of the school board, and in the Bureau's first major study, recommending competitive bidding in sewer contracting, which earned the enmity of the brick industry in the city, which had locked up the sewer business in the rapidly growing town. The early years were marked by a string of successes, including executive budgeting systems for the city of Detroit and the state of Michigan, civil service system for the city, and recognizing the demands that heavy motor cars and trucks were placing on the highways and byways, standards of construction for roads and alleys. In 1918, the Bureau also played a major part in the adoption of the first charter for the city of Detroit, which contained many Bureau positions, including competitive bidding and modern budgeting and accounting provisions. In 1920, the Bureau's first chairman, Otto Kirschner, died, symbolizing the end of the startup period for the Bureau, which now had staff members that would stay with it for the next decade, notably CPA Chester Reiter and engineer Harrington Place. Importantly, it also acquired a stable base of funding provided by the Community Fund, which is the predecessor of the United Way, which freed the Bureau from the nasty task of raising money to bring about improved government. Much of the low-hanging fruit of the Bureau's early years, budgeting, civil service, competitive bidding, and so on, was harvested, and now the Bureau turned its attention to tougher problems, one of which was the inequitable treatment of the Detroit area by a state legislature dominated by outstate legislators who tended to view the newly wealthy city as a cash cow. The Bureau strongly supported fair legislative apportionment, a goal yet to be fully realized and which continues to engage the attention of the Citizens Research Council. The Bureau's credibility brought it some unique engagements. In 1924, a group of civic leaders invited the Bureau to study the organization and administration of the city of Cincinnati. The result was the first full-blown administrative survey of a major American city, further enhancing the growing reputation of the Bureau. An even more significant undertaking occurred 2 years later following an historic incident of racial discord. In late 1925, African-American Ossian Sweet, a Howard University educated doctor, and his family moved into an all-white neighborhood on the Near East Side of Detroit. This provoked an attack on the home by a white so-called Improvement Association, and Sweet had enlisted the aid of his friends and relatives, and in the altercation, one of the whites was shot and killed. All of the people in the house that night were charged with murder. The NAACP enlisted the services of noted attorney Clarence Darrow, and in a series of sensational legal proceedings before Judge Frank Murphy, the charges were dropped. Although the trial was over, Mayor John Smith was concerned that the Sweet incident was only the tip of a very ugly iceberg. Smith, who had just survived 2 close elections against Charles Bowles, who was supported by the KKK, appointed a mayor's commission on race relations to study the condition of African Americans in Detroit and recommend reforms. To chair the committee, the Catholic Smith chose the young Protestant pastor of the Bethel Evangelical Church, Reinhold Niebuhr, who would leave Detroit 2 years later, and as a professor at the Union Theological Seminary in New York, would become one of the leading public intellectuals of the 20th century. The committee needed information on which to base its findings, and the Community Fund agreed to pay for the study on one condition: that it be supervised by the Detroit Bureau of Governmental Research. The Bureau actually did relatively little research in the project, which was directed by Forrester B. Washington, who had founded the Detroit Urban League 10 years earlier, and Robert T. Lansdale, a sociology professor at the University of Michigan. But the imprimatur of the Bureau was deemed important to the credibility of the study. The resulting study, The Negro in Detroit, was massive and covered nearly every subject from housing and education to police relations and church membership. And while its language may sound mildly patronizing today, the report was decades ahead of its time and was a watershed in understanding the problems facing Black Detroiters as they attempted to adjust to life in the Motor City. It was also a testimony to the status achieved by the Detroit Bureau in its first decade. The Bureau now found itself dealing with concerns of somewhat larger dimensions than competitive bidding and the size of the City Council. Many of these issues were related to the governance not just of the City of Detroit, but of the metropolitan area. The Bureau, in the early part of the century, Detroit was 28 square miles contained within Grand Boulevard. 20 years later, it had achieved its present size of 139 square miles, and its population had quadrupled. The Bureau concluded that the governmental structures in the Detroit area needed to be brought into alignment with the new realities of metropolitan development. Among its proposals were strengthening county government, developing regional entities for the provision of metropolitan area services, and reasoning that a first-class region needed a first-class transportation system. The Bureau advocated a subway system for the city for the region. And the proposed subway got as far as preparation of a bond issue in 1927, but it was pulled from the ballot at the last minute because of concerns about its $135 million price tag. Future movement toward regional transportation was then halted by the Depression, an economic event that brought to an end Detroit's period of astonishing growth. It also brought to an end the stability of the Detroit Bureau of Governmental Research and threatened the Bureau's continued existence. In 1930, the Community Fund withdrew its support, and the Bureau's income declined from $52,000 a year in 1930 to $16,000 in 1934. Its experienced and widely respected staff departed for more secure employment, and even Upson took a leave of absence and went to work for the Census Bureau in Washington, D.C. Left with a skeleton staff headed by Acting Director J.M. Leonard, the Bureau struggled on, but it could not mount a research program to deal meaningfully with the looming financial problems faced by the state of Michigan, and in particular, the city of Detroit. It became clear that in order to survive, the Detroit Bureau needed to reinvent itself. And in a stroke of amazing timing, it would have help in doing just that. Although Wayne State University traces its roots to the founding of the Detroit Medical College in 1868, the coalescence of schools that made it a recognizable university did not really occur until the period from 1923 to 1930. Before that, it was basically a junior college run by the Detroit Public Schools. By 1923, however, enrollment had skyrocketed, and the college became a four-year institution, the City College of Detroit. By 1930, it had attracted a law school, the medical college, and a pharmacy school, and a school of education, and the makings of a full-fledged university were in place. In 1933, the dean of the Liberal Arts School attempted to eliminate positions in the School of Education. Now, this was viewed with hostility by the folks at the Ed School, and it began a kerfuffle that led the Detroit Board of Education to the conclusion that the creation of a university with an executive to ride herd on these kinds of disputes was called for. The new institution was named Wayne University. Although nominally Superintendent Frank Cody was president of the university, he had a mushrooming school district to run, and so the day-to-day operational responsibility for Wayne University fell to his deputy, Charles L. Spain, who would play a key role in the future of the struggling Detroit Bureau. Charlie Spain was a native Hoosier, but was educated at the University of Michigan, and by 1901 found himself in the Detroit schools. He was a skilled administrator and rose through the ranks in the rapidly growing system, becoming deputy superintendent in 1919. It was during this time that he became acquainted with the Detroit Bureau and Len Upson, who provided numerous recommendations for the business operations of the Detroit school system, most of which were adopted. Spain was well aware of the value of the Bureau, which had also conducted a series of evening seminars at the City College beginning in 1927, and wanted to incorporate Upson's expertise into the fabric of the university. He first created a Detroit Social Science Research Council in early 1934, which was a consortium of Wayne faculty and Detroit Bureau staff aimed at applying research methods to the economic and social problems of the Detroit area. The studies that resulted were sufficiently well received that he and Upson, who was in Washington during most of 1935, felt emboldened to develop a plan for a School of Public Affairs and Social Work, which was announced in September of that year. The dean of the new school was Lent Upson, who would also retain his position as head of the Detroit Bureau. The school and the Bureau would occupy joint offices and share other facilities and would issue both joint reports and independent studies. Its first location was unworkably cramped, but in 1936, the school and the Bureau settled into offices in a vine-covered brown Victorian house at the intersection of Cass and Putnam, where State Hall is now located. So there it was. Wayne University needed a public administration program, and the Detroit Bureau needed a stable environment. The marriage worked well until the end of World War II. The studies were somewhat more academic in tone than they had been, but they covered topics of significance ranging from property taxation to the concept of a unicameral legislature. Efforts by the Bureau to restructure county government that had begun in the 1920s continued into the 1940s, and students of the school went on to distinguish careers in government and international affairs. Meanwhile, two separate developments were crystallizing that would shape the future of the Detroit Bureau and bring about the creation of the Citizens Research Council of Michigan. For the first, we have to go to Kansas City, where William Volker, who had made a fortune selling window treatments, had set up the Volker Fund to aid health and education in Kansas City and to rid the city of the machine politics of Tom Prendergast. He was aided in running the fund by his eccentric nephew, Harold Lunau. Lunau had struck up a relationship with the governmental researcher who had worked for Upson in the late 20s and early 30s, Loren B. Miller. Known as Red, Miller was, by 1937, the head of the New York Bureau of Municipal Research. Lunau was attracted to Miller's zeal for ridding municipal government of corrupt machines, but even more so to his libertarian philosophy toward government. In 1940, Lunau persuaded Miller to move to Kansas City and head a municipal research bureau there. With Miller's advice and guidance, the Volker Fund began to channel its funds toward libertarian economists such as Friedrich Hayek, Milton Friedman, and George Stigler, all of whom later won Nobel Prizes. In 1943, Malcolm Bingay of the Detroit Free Press wrote a series of editorials bemoaning the lack of top college graduates in governmental service. Upson sent the editorials to Lunau and Miller, and almost immediate response was funding for a national training school for public service to be housed at Wayne University. The training school, which was up and running in 1944, offered generous internships to promising students, and Volker Fellows became highly sought after. When the Volker program ended in the 1950s, it was taken up by the Earhart Foundation, which funded the internships until the foundation closed its doors last year. Upson was designated as director of the training school, and Miller would then come to Detroit as associate director. Upson would then step down as director of the Detroit Bureau of Governmental Research to be succeeded by Red Miller, who would then lead the organization for the next 14 years. The other consequential development began in 1937 in New York City. Alfred P. Sloan, who had just become chairman of the board of General Motors, hosted a lunch for some of his business associates in New York and proposed the creation of a national organization to monitor the tax and spending of governmental agencies, particularly state and local. The organization was to be called the Tax Foundation. Its role was twofold. First, to produce tax and spending research and analysis. Second, to foster the development of state organizations known as public expenditure surveys that would utilize the research in advocating their positions. Given Sloan's affiliation, it's not surprising that among the first states targeted for creation of a public expenditure survey was Michigan, and such a proposal was made in 1938 to a group that included GM President William Knudsen and 2 Detroit Bureau board members, Attorney Clifford Longley and CPA George Bailey. In early 1939, a pass-through organization, the Michigan Council for Tax Research, was created to provide a funding base for the Michigan Public Expenditure Survey. Although Upson went along with the creation of the survey, he retained a long-term skepticism regarding the militant taxpayer groups that were coming about, and urged the members of the board of the survey, most of whom were also on his board, to base survey positions on sound research. The Public Expenditure Survey had offices in both Detroit and Lansing, but the establishment of a statewide organization based on the model proposed by the Tax Foundation turned out to be more difficult than they had imagined. Although the Detroit Bureau supplied the survey with research and analysis, the creation of a statewide network of citizen organizations that would actually use the research in a responsible way proved to be an insurmountable challenge. All through the 40s, the survey struggled to gain traction, but by 1948, contributors showed their frustration with lack of results and began to withdraw their support. The board of the funding unit, the Council for Tax Research, then moved to close down the Public Expenditure Survey and transfer the remaining assets to the Detroit Bureau of Governmental Research in October of 1949. The acquisition by the Bureau of the assets of the Council for Tax Research resulted in a new organization with a statewide presence. In 1950, it was announced that the Bureau is changing its name to the Citizens Research Council of Michigan, and that the Office of the Public Expenditure Survey in the Old Porter Hotel in Lansing would become the state office of CRC. The basic structure and program of CRC were now in place and are still recognizable 65 years later. Although Upson and the Detroit Bureau had accomplished much in 3 decades, the Research Council would take on major statewide challenges in the years to come and demonstrate time and again the indispensability in a democracy of an organization that actually knows what it's talking about. Thank you.
So I'm going to seed the conversation with a few questions to get things going, and then I welcome any questions from the audience. So first of all, we left off in the 1950s, and it was during the 1950s that the organization was getting much more into the analysis of state government and the many issues confronting the operations of the state, ultimately leading up to a constitutional convention being called. So Earl, maybe you could walk us through a little bit about what those were, just laying the groundwork for Gil and his experience as a Concom delegate.
Sure. The question being, what were some of the motivating factors that led to the Constitutional Convention in the early 60s? The Constitution of 1908, by the late 50s, had become encrusted with numerous amendments, most of which did some constrictive things to the body of the document itself. Number one, revenues were dedicated to a number of sources, and the legislature was losing its ability to deal with any kind of flexible fashion with the budget. There were hundreds, literally hundreds, of executive agencies that reported either to commissions or to the governor himself, and that led to confusion and overlap and duplication. And finally, the Constitution had a, what shall I call it, a recondite apportionment formula that it used to apportion the legislature that virtually guaranteed the continuation of a majority of outstate legislators, even in the development of the urban areas in Detroit and Grand Rapids and Flint. And so by the late 50s, it was pretty clear that something needed to be done, and there were a number of statewide groups that got together, George Romney being a prominent member of it, to go for a constitutional convention. And I'll let Gil.
There's not the slightest doubt that the Citizens Research Council of Michigan, more than any other group, was responsible for the success of the Constitutional Convention 55 years ago. Between 1958 and 1964, it produced and published 60 books, pamphlets, and reports analyzing our state's constitutional provisions and issues. And here they are, all 60 of them, from my collection at the State Archives, from which I borrowed them for tonight to show you. They're, in particular, I want to call attention to this council's 2-volume comparative analysis of the Michigan Constitution, which was and is a monument of practical scholarship and was of immense value to the convention. It involved a number of the best minds in the state. Every delegate to the convention had a copy of it at his or her desk on the convention floor, and every delegate used it. It was far and away the most important outside reference that we had. It saved us a great amount of time, and it also, the knowledge which it imparted also saved us from countless errors. The other 59 publications were directed at the general public, its opinion leaders, and the news media, and helped immeasurably to create an accurate understanding of the convention's work.
You have a question relative to this?
Yes, is it now appropriate?
Yeah.
Well, if our Constitution were a person, it could be eligible for membership in AA or pre-now. And as you mentioned, the previous Constitution was encrusted with amendments, as our current Constitution is as well. What are your views on a new con? Are the underpinnings of the current Constitution good enough to maintain and just keep amending this Constitution, or are we getting into the zone now where we should be looking towards a new one?
Asking me?
Well,
Or who?
I can do that. Let me give one of the principles that were adopted by early governmental research organizations back in the teens and 20s was the idea of direct democracy, the initiative, the referendum, and the recall. And because they weren't terribly confident that the legislatures at the time were actually representing them, and they had this idea that by giving the voters a safety valve that they could use to circumvent the legislature and adopt policies through direct vote, that things would be better off. By the late 30s, Lindstrom concluded that process had been hijacked, that it no longer served the purpose that it was intended for, and that it was being used largely to insert into the 1908 Constitution positions favorable to the sponsors of the ballot issues. That probably, those words in 1939, I think he spoke them, could probably be spoken in 2016 regarding the 1963 Constitution. It's among the easiest to amend in the whole country, largely because it has the initiative, but also because the thresholds of getting something on the ballot are not particularly high. As a result, what you get are things like term limits. You get things like anti-gay marriage provisions, and a lot of things that really don't lend themselves to a understandable and enduring Constitution. I don't know if I've made my position clear, but I think that the current Constitution suffers from some of many of the same defects that the one, virtually the same amount of revenue is earmarked now as it was in 1959, before the Constitution was adopted. And so it shows a lot of the same problems, partly because the '63 Constitution wasn't a dramatic break with the 1908 Constitution. A lot of people think the 1835 Constitution was the best one.
Gil, do you have anything to add on this?
Well, I'm glad you mentioned the 1835 Constitution, because it was a short constitution with relatively few, if any, restrictions on the power of the legislature. And I remember reading that Michigan's great jurist Thomas M. Cooley said that in this respect it may be regarded as a model. Well, 15 years later, they had 15 years of experience with Michigan's first legislature, which drove the state into bankruptcy, did all kinds of things that were very, very disagreeable to the public. So a new constitutional convention was called in 1850, and it turned out to be a long one with all kinds of restrictions on the legislature, and that has more or less been the pattern ever since. It, of course, is a question: how much are you willing to trust the legislature? You see, to many members of the public, and today, if you can believe what we all absorbed through all of the news media, the legislature, and especially Congress, whose shadow really casts itself over all legislative bodies in the country, has a very poor reputation. So a lot of people feel that if they want what they think is a provision required by good government, it better get into the Constitution. Number one, because they don't trust the legislature to do it on its own. And secondly, even if they do trust them to do it, they don't want to have to watch them. They just get tired of watching them. They don't want to watch, they just want to have it fixed, and then they can watch other aspects of what they're doing. And I think that is a continuing problem, and it requires a very great deal of study, research, and then also a measure of compromise in order to improve things.
Let's move on. So Earl, in the book you talk about tax revolts and the idea that while Michigan went through a great deal of trial and error and proposal and defeat, that maybe there really was not a tax revolt. So again, laying the groundwork, so John, if you could maybe follow up on Earl's thoughts and your experience watching the legislature, watching the Headleys and Tishes of Michigan put out ideas and how that played out, and how the Research Council helped you as a journalist to weed through these things. Maybe repeat your quote from earlier.
Well, the quote that although I'll modify it since some people here have delicate ears, what I said was, somebody's got to read this boring crap. It might as well be you guys. You know, you look at a painting, but you don't see the paint. You look at a house, but you don't see the plumbing. And yet, if you don't have the paint, you don't have the painting. If you don't have the plumbing, you're not going to have much of a house. And the stuff that these guys do, and this happens to be stuff from 1993, 1994 on Proposal A, this is the paint. This is the plumbing. This is the boring crap that gets into the details on how things are actually going to work. Because you always start off with an idea of how something's going to work. And then at some point later on, you're going to find out, there's a lot of stuff you didn't think about. There are a lot of implications to what you've adopted that didn't come to mind, and yet are there, and there's not much you can do about them. And you can look at our federal constitution and our state constitution. So the tax revolt, for those of you, it was starting to brew pretty intently in the late 60s and the early 70s when I worked for the Daily Telegram in Adrian, Michigan. That whole section of Michigan was just a hotbed of people who were against taxes of every sort. And of course, in 1978, you had the successful massive tax cut that took place in California, and the organizers of that came to Michigan and held a giant rally, and here you had Dick Headley, whose name topped this effort to put limitations on how the state could use taxes and what they could do with them. And then you had Bob Tisch, who of course was the drain commissioner in Shiawassee County, who had a major tax cut. To a certain degree, we have the Headley tax limitation amendment because of Bob Tisch. If they hadn't both been on the ballot at the same time, I'm not sure what would have happened with Headley. But with both of them on, all of the political establishment, including Governor Milliken at the time, came out in support of Headley because they were scared to death of what would happen if Tisch passed. And what would have happened if Tisch had passed is government revenues would have been slashed beyond the bone. There would have been nothing left, and that was a tremendous concern. And these guys, you know, they're the ones that looked into all of these different implications. Now, my wife, Cindy Kyle over there, her former boss spoke to this group a year ago, and one of the things he spoke about was all of the different attempts to change the state's tax code, especially property taxes, that extended for very nearly 15 years, and all of which failed. And it was one of the damnedest things you could ever, because nobody liked taxes. Everyone bitched and moaned and complained about paying taxes, and yet every time they were offered a proposal, they turned it down. And you know, the only conclusion you could reach is that they hated taxes, and they hated the alternative even worse, which they couldn't, but they didn't quite know what the alternative was going to be, but they were afraid of it. And that's where, you know, we had in June of 1993 another vote on another tax proposal that failed. And so the legislature was going to come in and pass a 20% property tax cut. And they had scheduled a session. There was some talk about what was to go on, what they were going to do. John Cherry was in the Senate, and Bob Emerson, who was in the House, were having dinner at Ramon's, for those of you who remember Ramon's, on the north side of town, and they got to talking, and John pulled out a pen and grabbed a cocktail napkin and wrote out an amendment and took it to caucus. And Debbie Stabenow said, "Can I offer the amendment?" John said, "It's yours." And that, of course, was the amendment to eliminate all property taxes for education. Now, cell phones were not as common back then, and we had this absolutely horrid system, I imagine some of you also did, which was supposed to pipe in the live proceedings for the House and the Senate into your offices, and it was notable mostly because it never worked. And I didn't have a cell phone, and clearly something was going on, and the Senate Republicans had left the door to their caucus room open. And so I walked in, I picked up the phone, I called Larry Lee, who was writing the story, which was about the 20% tax cut passing, you know, just to have that ready to go. And the first thing I said is the speaker working? And Larry said, "No, speaker's not working. Why would you think the speaker's working? I can't hear what's going on over there." And he says, "You will not goddamn believe what's happening over here." And that set off this race to the finish. Those of us who were there for the however long it was on December 23rd, December 24th, still get the shakes when we think about it. But this plan that ended up as Proposal A, and everybody saw that as a tax proposal, which it was. But in the end, and I wrote a blog about this last week, in the end, more significantly, it was a major change to how we did education in the state. In theory, to make education better. We can see how well that's worked. And this happens to be the document that your guys came up with after the governor made his speech in October, setting out the outlines for what he wanted to see happen to replace the property tax revenue. And the tax proposal of it, A lot of that ended up being adopted. Now, obviously, the public voted for it not because they liked it, but because they were more afraid of the alternative, which was going to be a big increase in the income tax. But it also goes back and goes through all of these massive changes that Governor Engler had talked about in education. I mean, the charter school one is the biggest one. That's the one that got passed. But all this other stuff that, frankly, I'd forgotten most about. You know, changing the structure of the State Board of Education, doing away with the union shop for schools, all kinds of proposals. Engler had read a book or two that had come out on charter schools a couple of years before. No, there were no charter schools in the country, as far as I can tell. You know, it was one of these great ideas that nobody knew if it would work or not, but by God, we got to go for it. And he was convinced that that's what we needed to do. And so, this document, I mean, this was a shorthand way of sort of pointing out all of the massive changes that were actually being talked about. As I say, we were all focused on the tax part of it. All anybody was really worried about was, were the schools going to be open on January 1st, 1994? But this told you more. This was the paint. This was the plumbing. This told you what was going to come out of it. And then, when the proposal came up, they had more of this other stuff. And honest to God, for a reporter, this stuff is gold. Because, you know, we look at stuff, we follow it, but like I said, you know, I'm going to read it, but I ain't going to read all the boring crap. You know, I need somebody else to do that. And these are the guys that do it, and these are the guys that condense it and put it into an understandable form. And so, you know, I appreciate, I feel sorry for you in some respects for having to read all that stuff, but I can't tell you how, from my standpoint, I appreciate the work that you guys have done, not just for the citizens, but from my own personal professional reasons. So,
Earl, you talk a little bit in the book about we lived through Headley and that affected state and local taxation. Proposal A, as John has said, has had some impacts on charter schools and otherwise, but for the most part, Headley is kind of a big so what. You want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, the one of the key provisions, or at least it was thought to be one of the key provisions at the time, was holding state revenues to a percentage of state personal income. Well, guess what? It was I can't remember exactly. It was a year or two before the amendment was. It was that percentage that was a year or two before the amendment was adopted. I think it was 9.5%.
Yeah, 9.5.
It's never been anywhere near that since then. So that was a completely ineffective cap. The parts of Headley that have had some effect were ones that I don't know that they were afterthoughts, but they weren't generally considered to be the key element in the quote tax revolt part of the amendment, such things as requiring the state to pay for local mandates and that kind of thing. With respect to Proposal A, yes, there were some significant changes. I wasn't in Michigan when Proposal A was on the ballot. I was still in Indiana at the time, but I kept up with what was going on. And I guess I had a basic problem with the way Proposal A was put across. As John mentioned, almost all, except for Headley, all of the proposals had failed. And including Proposal A of 1993, which was in many respects very similar to Proposal A of 1994. But in its infinite wisdom, the legislature put on this it wasn't a poison pill, I guess, but it was this alternative legislative proposal that would go into effect automatically if Proposal A failed. So that if you voted down Proposal A, you automatically, instead of getting an increase in the sales tax, you got an increase in the income tax. So so they were basically saying to the electorate, do you want belladonna or do you want strychnine? You know, it was that kind of thing. And while I understood their frustration, in you know, there were a lot of folks who were saying, well, you know, these people have been demanding tax cuts for all these years, now we're going to force them into choosing something. Well, I don't know whether they were demanding tax cuts, and B, my wonkish sense was offended by the fact that you could not vote on Proposal A on its own merits, because you always had the legislative proposal waiting in the wings if you voted Proposal A down. And I have enough respect for constitutional provisions that I think voters ought to be able to vote on them without calling in another set of policies automatically.
I guess I'll add a different point of view, since I worked in the legislature at that time and literally did Proposal A the year after Proposal A was passed, and did all of school finance for 15 years. So from that perspective, first of all, they didn't have any backup plan. If something turned down, there was nothing else unless they put a backup plan in. And I think in the late hours, they didn't have it. Their backs were against the wall. But Proposal A, you know, when I talk to legislators today about Proposal A, they don't know what Proposal A was. It's either a school finance. Oh, they said they were going to do X and Y. You know, everyone was going to get the same foundation allowance. Everyone was going to get, you know, this and that. And it never, if you look at it, it never was intended to do that. But I will tell you, the year after Proposal A in school finance, they went against what they did. There was supposed to be a calculation, an index, and the foundation allowances for these school districts were supposed to grow. 1 year, they followed that rule. After that, they never followed that rule. They did either more or they didn't do anything. And so Proposal A, I don't want to say it failed, because I don't think it failed, because I think it did some really good things. I think it really has closed the gap between the highest and lowest funded school districts, like it was supposed to do. You can argue, you know, what schools did with the money. That's a different thing. But I think on a strictly financial basis, it did what it was supposed to do, in the sense of just on the foundation allowance. It gave the lowest funded schools a lot more additional money than schools at the top. And when we look at it now, you can still see schools at the top have gotten lots below CPI inflation, where schools at the bottom have gotten triple where they were at before. So I think Proposal A was the answer at the time. I think Proposal A now can be modified. I think they have tried to modify, but what we haven't touched upon is you now have legislators that are term limited, and when Proposal A went into place, you had legislators who had been around for a very long time, had relationships, understood taxation, understood school finance, worked together, and were able to do that. And I don't know today if that's even, if that's possible.
Well, to vastly oversimplify, as infrastructure becomes more and more in the news, I'm hearing, you know, the municipalities are saying that the state tax structure is starving them, and they can't afford to do the infrastructure. The spokesman for the Speaker of the House a little while ago said, well, the cities have made bad choices. Yeah, it's their fault. Is the Citizens Research Council working and doing research to try to sort this out? It's really a hot button right now. Is there work being done to figure out what's going on here?
Yes, we are. Last year, we did a paper on state revenue sharing, documenting how the legislature has grossly underfunded the promises made to local governments with the state revenue sharing. And because it has been neglected since the turn of the century, even if they were to fund it today, they don't have a system for distributing it in a way that addresses needs. Also, we're looking at the property tax system, and we have a system, kind of the combination of Headley and Proposal A, that even when local governments begin to see recoveries, begin to see the markets begin to flourish again, Headley knocks them back. And so the example I give is the city of East Point that lost 47% of its tax base over 6 or 7 years, and because of the combination of these tax limitations, under the most optimistic growth scenarios, won't get back to where they were in 2007 until the year 2035. So we're looking at the property tax system, we're looking at alternatives. What can be done? How do we address this? Some of this is going to be in paper form, but we're also going around the state talking to different groups, working with the Municipal League and SEMCOG and some of the academics in our universities to try to get a greater understanding of why this occurred and what can be done about it.
I think one of the real problems, and has plagued Michigan since the 30s, is that local government provides the services that most people value. Education, parks and rec, infrastructure,
Public safety.
police and fire. These are the services that most people really want. They don't particularly want state police pulling them over. They're not really enamored of mental health facilities or prisons. These are not the kinds of services, while they may be necessary, they're not the kinds of services that get people supporting government. But what we've got is that the services that they value are supported by the tax that they hate, whereas the state level, a lot of it's from the sales tax, and that's one that that's probably the tax that they find least offensive. And so how do you bring that kind of a situation into balance so that you've got some kind of popular support for taking care of your sewers?
That's a great segue to another topic that's hit on in the paper, the idea of the fiscal crises that beset our state from time to time, being a state that's highly dependent on manufacturing. Mariana, in our time working in different paths, you've dealt with a couple of fiscal crises in the 1980s and then 2000s. Tom Clay was circulating around the state, spreading the word that the sky is falling, the sky is falling. Can you bring some perspective on your role in the House Fiscal Agency and trying to help legislators to understand and how you understood the Research Council playing a similar role?
I think the Research Council, my director at the time, Mitch Bean, and the Senate Fiscal Agency Director, Gary Olson, were all on the same page. They'd all been around. They all believed there was an issue in the sense of a structural problem building. And I don't know if they were ever on the same panel together, but I know they at times all went out on the state and talked about that issue to try to get the legislature to engage in the issue that you can't keep funding itself with revenues that are no longer going to be in existence or what we call now one-time appropriations that you get a pot of money one time and then it's gone the next year. I wasn't there in the 80s. You've been around a little bit longer than me, but 2000 is the first time that I really hit in the fiscal agency and John Engler trying to get out of town before the economy crashed and didn't quite make it. And then under Granholm, her whole 8 years were horrible, where there was no revenue growth. It was all cuts. Everything was cuts. And then now I see. Well, then actually at the end in the middle of Granholm, the tax, trying to pass a tax increase that was John, a fiasco. 2007. I thought it was the first time ever there was. Were you here then?
Yeah.
Yeah, so Bob and I, and we were spending the night in our office on the weekend, and That happened for 6 weeks in a row, where they were trying to pass a tax increase where they'd come in and they would just leave the voting board open and for 48 hours and nothing happened. But that's where you had, they couldn't work together. They couldn't, that's where it was just divisive. And the divisiveness, I think, is the hardest part now, I don't want to say they're divisive, to be divisive, but they couldn't come to a solution. Some wanted to cut, some wanted to raise revenue, and no one could agree what to do, and so we hit stalemates. You don't see it quite as much right now because it's all one party, but I think under the three entities were 2 Democrats and 1 Republican, it didn't work so well in the legislature. And
The thing about the budget crisis in 2007 that Mary Ann was talking about was the legislature basically never adjourned.
like
I mean,
literally.
Literally, for like 6 weeks. It was 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, essentially. The only time they actually did adjourn was for the high holy days, for Rosh Hashanah and the New Year. And those were the days that, yeah, those were the days they could actually come in and clean the chambers. Because, no kidding, the House and Senate were starting to smell a little bad. Because they were so loaded with pizza boxes and pop bottles and sandwich wrappers and people who had just basically been there and Cindy.
Well, and they would lock them in.
They would lock them in.
They would lock them into the chambers.
And not only were they nonstop, we were nonstop. I mean, we were basically 24 hours. Cindy one day said to me, "Why don't you rent a room at the hotel so that, staff can go there?" And I tried to do it. All the rooms are booked up. The Radisson is still living off of, what they made in 2007. It was crazy time. I mean, we've been through some, I'm old enough to have gone through some of these, late 70s, early 80s, stuff we ran into in the early 90s, that, as Mary Ann was saying, that a whole horrible decade, but I'd never seen anything like that. And it's just gotten progressively worse. I mean, the only thing that has stopped it is the fact that it's all one-party rule right now.
Right.
But I mean, one of the best reporting stories I can tell, it again involves Cindy, and it involves a budget crisis, and I'll tell you what it was. It was in the late 70s. Back before computers, when everything was still on typewriters, and at the time, reporters were allowed to stand outside the door at Governor Milliken's office. Joanna was here, she would remember that, and so there was some late night crisis meeting of the Quadrant and the governor and Jerry Miller, and all of us were shoved up against the door, and at some hour, the door opened a crack, and Bob Berg poked his head out and said, "Well, we've got an arrangement, and we'll get the details out to you shortly." And so, bang, we're all taken off. We're all out of there. We're going for it, except for Cindy, who was with the Associated Press at the time. And she just sort of stood there. And Berg turned around and he said to the executive office, "They're all gone." And so these guys come pouring out of there, and they go in there and they come up to the typewriters. They pull the covers off the typewriters and they start trying to type up the deal. Well, none of these guys knew how to type. None of them had taken typing in high school and that sort of thing. I don't know how to do this. All right, who knows here how to type? And then here's this little voice over on the side saying, "I know how to type." And they all turn around, "The girl, get the girl." So Cindy comes over there. Here she is, a reporter for the Associated Press. Okay, and then the tax rate will be what again? Okay, and so Bob Berg and George Weeks are standing and say, "Motherfucking." And so she finishes it up. Berg takes it in, gets all these copies of it, hands it out to everyone so they can go running back to their caucuses, and then he hands a copy to Cindy and says, "It's your story." But I mean, the point is, here you got all these guys in Milliken's office, Republicans and Democrats working out something, trying to reach an agreement. Nothing like that in 2007. Nothing like that in 2007. And if you had divided government now, nothing like that now. Nothing.
Or not very often.
I'll give you that, but
Not very often.
Earl, tell the story of enactment of the sales tax diversion amendment in the 1940s. And And the Citizens Research Council at the time said, this isn't a good idea.
Right. During, let me see, how will in the 1930s, a couple of things happened. Number one, there was the property tax limitation, the 15 mil limit placed into the Constitution in 1932. That is still in the Constitution after all these years in somewhat modified form, which did limit the property tax. Also, but it did make the property tax largely a local tax. The state had participated in the property tax before that, but in exchange for that, a sales tax was imposed by the state to pay for state services. Well, by the end of World War II, the limitations on the property tax had begun to constrict local governments, and the state was in pretty good financial condition because it had a productive tax, particularly right after World War II when spending went nuts, consumer spending. And so the locals decided, well, we need to divert money from the sales tax to local units of government. And I've forgotten exactly what it was. It was some of a 3% sales tax. I think it was 0.5% went to local units and 1.5% went to schools. At any rate, it went to much of the sales tax was diverted to local units of government. And the Detroit Bureau of Governmental Research at the time said, this is not a sustainable arrangement, because what it's going to do is going to make it, you're going to have a decade of fiscal crisis for the state. And that's exactly what happened, and that characterized much of Soapy Williams' administration was dealing with a very difficult budget situation.
And that has repeated itself over history, that it's that the dedication of revenues, the constriction on the state, and the trickle-down economics that it balances its budget on the backs of the local governments as this plays out.
Term limits has been mentioned, and it seems to me that since the enactment of term limits and because of it, the importance of the research which the council does has been magnified many times. That's not just because the legislators need to know what's going on, and they don't have the years to accumulate the information, and they don't have anybody sitting next to them who's been there for years who can tell them. And that's not the only reason. They also need to know more so they can explain it to the public. Most of them haven't been there long enough to know really how the legislature itself works, let alone the massive executive branch of government, which if the public knew more accurate facts about, they would be able to act in a more rational way. I know when I went on a lot of my colleagues at the Constitutional Convention went on to great political careers. I got on the County Board of Commissioners. And I thought, county government is very complicated, by the way. It's the most complicated local government form in Michigan. I got on there and I thought, well, there'll be a guy come around, probably from the controller's office with a little book. He'll show me how it actually works. Well, I got on there, there are 40-some members. That guy never came around. So I was there. How does this work? Nobody came to tell me. I had to sit there and work it out. Well, I did work it out after a few years. I was chairman, but the point is, that is, in fact, I wrote a little book about it that was used for many years in educating newly elected county commissioners. But the point is that this kind of thing is very damaging to the system, and the only way around it that I can see, and it may not work, but it sure is worth trying, is the educational type of work that you guys are doing.
When I was in Indiana, some people were noted that Michigan was adopting term limits. And I said, and somebody, one of the reporters asked me what I expected to have happen in Michigan as a result. And my response was children playing with the power tools.
That's about right, isn't it?
Since term limits, has the use of your research increased, or is it just put in the dusty part of the desk drawer?
It's hard to answer that because coinciding with the implementation of term limits has also been the growth of the internet. And the internet has been a godsend for the Citizens Research Council. When I started 30 years ago, we published about 5,000 reports and mailed 2,500 of them and hoped that the other people would come and ask for the balance of them. And when those were gone, they were gone. And we had, with our analysis of the ballot issues we do every year, a couple of years ago, we had the question on renewable energy, and we had 180,000 downloads of that report.
Wow.
So are more people using our research? Certainly. Is it because of a thirst for knowledge with the term limits and the lack of institutional knowledge? I don't know.
There's no way to measure the amount of good that it does. Even in the old days, there was no way to know how many people got real help out of this, just at the Constitutional Convention, not to mention outsiders. As I say, referring to it saves time, keeps you from making bad mistakes, but you don't report that to anybody. There's no way to quantify it.
No.
Well, I mean, your point on the ballot proposals, I've told people, many people, you know, you're limited to what, 100 words on the ballot. You're not going to get a whole lot of that. I've told people all the time, go to the Citizens Research Council website. Look what they've written. They're going to have the best stuff that's free of political taint, and it'll tell you what this stuff will do, and they'll give you examples of the overall implications. I have no idea how many people have actually taken me up on that advice, but I mean, that's, in many respects, that's, from the standpoint of both a reporter and a citizen, that's, in some respects, the best thing you do, is provide that kind of information.
Right, because you guys even, for us, our turnaround is quick. That we have to turn something around extremely quickly, where you can take the extra time and just focus on the one issue. And we'll do the same thing. Look at Citizens Research Council. You know, they've got a fuller, more in-depth question, answer, whatever, however the layout you do, than we can put together in the time frame that we have.
We explain to people that when it comes.
And by the way, because you have two fiscal agency people with you, kind of helps.
One for you. We tell people that when it comes to the initiative and referendum, we the people have retained to ourselves the legislative role. We have the House Fiscal Agency and the Senate Fiscal Agency to help our elected officials when they play that role that we elect them for. But when we retain it to ourselves, we're often asked the most important questions, amending the Constitution, things that the legislature won't even touch, and now we're asked to do it. And so if not the Citizens Research Council, then who? Who's going to give you the knowledge to make an informed decision, to think through the issues and the long-term implications of those? So,
Earl, along those lines, mentioned the great frequency with which our Constitution is amended through the constitutionally outlined initiative process. And it has always seemed to me that there were perhaps two things that could be done to to help solve that very serious problem. One is, of course, I think as you implied, to raise the percentage of signatures that's required to get something on the ballot, but perhaps even more important is to, if possible legally, to create a situation where the petition circulators have to be from the area in which they're gathering signatures. I realize that's a legal question.
I think the Sixth Circuit already answered.
Well, I've read that opinion in the past, and I thought there was a way around that, I may be wrong.
We'll have a conversation.
Yeah, but the point is that the way you get something on the ballot is hiring it to get the signatures. They may cost you $15 a piece to get 300,000 or 400,000 signatures on these petitions to get through. In addition to that, you have to have one of the 2 or 3 or 4 very best election lawyers in the state to draw up your petition and set up the instructions for how to circulate it, or you're almost certainly going down to defeat. That means it's big money that's going to get something on the ballot, with rare exceptions, of course. And anything that we could do to make it less easy for big money to just hire petition circulators, a lot of them from out of state, to come in and beat the drum at shopping malls and get people to sign these signatures of where they often don't know very much about it, would reduce the number of these purely economically motivated constitutional amendment proposals. So those are just a couple of ideas. The Sixth Circuit, as you say, you've got to work your way around that.
Eric, one of my favorite CRC publications that comes out periodically is really your constitutional cleanup research on all of the various things that have become kind of constitutional dead wood, but there's really no good way to figure out how you would get that on a ballot and have the voters kind of excise that from the actual document itself. But nonetheless, it's good to have that come out periodically and just show you how much deadwood is still, at least in the Constitution, that's changed because of U.S. Supreme Court decisions or various other things.
You'd like to think that what's in the Constitution actually is in effect. The 21-year-old voting age isn't in effect.
And it makes it difficult to use the document itself in educating students around the state on how their state government is run. Because I don't think there is an edition. Let's call it a red letter edition, which has all the stuff that's been blotted out in red, so the other stuff is what's available. And we don't even have that. So it would be a great thing for the public to have some sort of a cleanup. But I'm afraid that contradicts one of the basic principles of legislation, which is let sleeping dogs lie.
Several
Well, if
years
you even tried that, I mean, you go back to what the Democrats did a few years ago with that massive petition thing. If you even tried, I don't know how many provisions there are, what, a dozen or more, that are no longer valid? I mean, if you even tried that, would you run afoul of the whole question as to whether or not you got to call another convention to deal with the...
Each one would have to be voted on separately. The question is, the hard part's getting them on the ballot.
If you could have this alternative that says if you don't vote for cleaning this up, automatically we're going to have another constitutional convention, that would scare them. That would really scare them,
The proposal A.
Several years ago, I had a conversation with Richard McClellan, and my question was, I mean, I've always thought that there should be 2 kinds of tests applied to any constitutional proposal. One is it good policy? But not only that, is it good constitutional policy? And that is, has it risen to the level that it ought to be put in the state's basic governing document? And too often, that's not the case. It's often the case that it's to get somebody's social agenda embedded in the Constitution or something like that. And he said he didn't know of any way you could keep keep it limited to good constitutional policy. He said if the voters want to put a cake recipe in the Constitution, they can do it, and that's probably true. But I have to going back into the history. The initiative in the 1908 Constitution, the initiative provision was very restrictive, and it was modified in 1910 so that it was more workable, and it's more like it is now. I'll bet you don't know what the first successful initiated constitutional amendment was, so I'll tell you. It was prohibition.
Wow.
The second successful initiated constitutional amendment was repeal.
Mary Ann, what would it take to get the legislature to clean up these constitutional amendments?
There's no interest. Honestly, I don't think there's any interest. It doesn't benefit them.
You know, there is one problem with it though, and the ones are now obsolete because the U.S. Supreme Court has ruled that in effect they are obsolete, they no longer apply. But the trouble is, someone can very well say and even think, maybe the Supreme Court is going to change back. In which case, this constitutional language is still going to mean something again, and that really complicates it when you get into certain very sensitive areas.
There's only a few of those. Most of those.
Yeah, right.
Any other questions?
Just a quick question, comment, but one, in talking about term limits, it's something that I was thinking just today, in fact. So I would say I proudly work for the CRC. I'm a proud alum of the House Fiscal Agency. I do think one of the, so I'll do a little shout out for Mary.
You do that.
I do think one of the saving graces for the legislature and for legislative deliberations in the post-term limits environment is that in Michigan, and I think we're pretty unique in having a very equipped, professional, nonpartisan policy staff in both the House and the Senate. And I do think both fiscal agencies keep the guy from the controller's office with the little book really is there for the state House and Senate members. And I don't know. I'm thinking you started probably too late to know. I'm just maybe John can answer. I'm thinking about post-term limited legislator, but with the professional staffs, the nonpartisan professional staffs, versus a non-term limited legislature in the 1960s. But there's no fiscal agencies, and there's no that professional staff doesn't exist. Which was less dysfunctional, and why?
Well, the pre-term limited legislature was less dysfunctional. And I don't go back to the 60s here, but I remember hearing people talk about in the 70s, how it was before the fiscal agencies existed and how much they liked them. Now, obviously, there were all these big fights that the fiscal agencies were already having during the budget time, and probably one of the best things Engler really pushed for was the revenue estimating conference. At least you had a number that everyone had to agree to. Back, I remember in the 79-80 period, Moorburg would come up with a number, and the House would have theirs, and then the Senate would have their numbers, and the executive office would have their numbers, and nobody could agree on anything. And they kept passing budget bills back and forth all the time. But one of the things about the pre-term limited legislature is it was sort of like everybody in the legislature, if they've been there long enough, got to be experts on something. They all had some interest. In a lot of cases, it involved because they had a personal issue. Charlie Barnum, who was kind of a party animal as an individual, but he had family members who had severe mental illness problems. And he became an expert on how the mental health system worked in the state, how it was funded. He was conservative on anything else except mental health. He just always wanted to pour more money into mental health. But he understood it. And if people had a question about it, they could go to him. You know, there was a guy named Buzz Spagnola who got to know road stuff
Yep.
really, really well. And people would come.
Montgomery on taxes.
Yeah, or George Montgomery on taxes. These guys became experts. So to a certain degree, there wasn't quite the need for the fiscal agency, at least when it came to some of the policy questions. They still needed it to, to cook the numbers so that everyone knew what they were talking about. But now, you have none of that. You have none of that. And the caucuses are now the dominant players. I don't think anyone really anticipated that. When term limits passed, everyone was saying, oh, the lobbyists will run everything, or the executive office will run anything. And in many respects, at least as far as the legislature's come down to, it's the caucus leaders are the ones running everything.
And they're only term limited.
Yeah, and they're all term limited.
Well, I came to sign a fiscal agency in 1975. You know, a long time ago in a galaxy far away. I was there in 87. But what you were saying, those people knew what they were doing. But more importantly, they'd all yell and scream at each other during the day.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then
Yeah, and they go out and
afterwards, we'd go to the hotel, which has now been sanctified by the Catholic Conference building.
Yeah.
And we sit there and everything was worked out. And it didn't make that much difference whether you're Republican or Democrat. The old guys were mentoring the new people. And sometimes they really didn't want to know how some of the deals were made. I still remember the unholy alliance between Milligan and Southwest or Southeast Michigan and the Upper Peninsula. They said the most awful things about each other. But then they'd all work it out. And like education, I was involved in there. The kid, Jack Faxon in the Senate and Jim O'Neill in the House. My goodness.
Yeah.
It was just.
Larry Lee, the guy who I succeeded as publisher, he has a boat, and the National Conference of State Legislatures was having their annual meeting in Milwaukee, and so Larry decided this was the thing. He was going to sail across Lake Michigan for the first time, and he took off. I had his obit prepared because I figured next thing we do, we were going to get a call from the Coast Guard about they found this little lifeboat thing floating. But when he got over there, he decided he was going to hold a reception for the Michigan members who had gone to the conference. And so he went on, he got cheese. You always get cheese in Wisconsin. And he got beer and he got wine. And all these folks came and sat in the boat and had a very nice time. And this was in the, I forget exactly when. I don't know if you remember, Joanna, but it was the late 90s or the early 2000s.
I think it was his second.
Yeah, it was the second boat. It was the bigger boat, and he had all these guys, Republicans and Democrats, sitting there, having a drink, eating cheese, and they all said afterwards, I've never sat down with this guy. I've never talked to this guy. People have talked to us, and they said, well, what do you think people should do so they learn how to get together? I said, shit, go out and get drunk together. And they all think I'm joking. I said, I'm not joking. Go and get drunk. That's how they did it. Get liquored up a little bit and have somebody drive you home. But you'll get to know each other. If nothing else, you'll get to understand what you have in common. Because everyone's got 90% of what's in their life is in common with everyone else. Everyone's got, everyone's moaning about how they had to take the dog to the vet, or the kids are late for school, or the plumber didn't show up, or whatever. I mean, everyone's got that together. Nobody seems to see that anymore. No one seems to see those common problems, and they all have them. And so how do you figure out a way of working on them?
Another way that the pre-term limit days provided something different was that it allowed the guys who'd been there a few years to work more on developing their own personalities.
Yeah, sure.
I remember one of the guys got up on the Senate floor and described one of the other ones as wise as a tree full of owls. I forget
Yeah, well-
what that was.
well, I mean-
And another guy who just loved to have public institutions named after him, who were from the UP,
Oh, yeah, of
named
course, yeah.
Jacobetti, you know.
Oh, yeah.
That was his hobby, and he was able to develop that over the years.
We
And I
used-
know Rusty Hillman
Oh,
was
God,
was
Rusty
a house
Hillman.
guy up there, and one time in the, I think, was he in the Senate too?
Rusty, no, he was in the house.
Just in the House. Anyway, a buddy of mine was over there working for the House, one of the agencies in the House, and things were really bad in the UP, and Rusty was trying to get something through that would help them up in the UP. He said, "We're terribly poor up there." He said, "Things are just awful." He said, it takes 3 farms just to service 1 tomcat." He said
God love him,
you never hear anything remotely like that today.
Well, we
I
used
think,
to-
you know, it's,
We used to keep a quote board, and it became internationally known, the quote board did. Johnny Carson used some of the quotes from the quote board, you know.
Ah.
Rusty Hellman, quote from Rusty Hellman, "I praised an animal once and I married her." You know, said that on the floor of the House, you know. Justice Mary Stallings Colvin, it was swearing a guy in and said, "Our democracy is a 3-way street." You got to think about that for a minute, you know. And I mean, and so these were all on the quote board. And there was a guy from the Wall Street Journal, and he was doing a story, and he saw this, and he wrote this. And it was on the front page of the Wall Street Journal, this little feature thing they have, and it went nuts. George Will still occasionally quotes. Harry DeMasso, "From now on, I'm looking at everything you do through a fine-tooth comb." So nobody talks like that anymore. Nobody. They're all handed these sheets. You know, the press people have handed them, and they read these things, and they're the most boring crap that you've ever heard. Nobody has a personality anymore.
You know,
Nobody
one of
does.
the best deals on appropriations in the Senate, back when I was there, was Zoller and Lane.
Oh God, yeah.
No, they were inseparable. I mean, it was like, when I first came to the Senate, I'm like, how do Democrats get along with Republicans? Well, they were attached to the hip, and when one was chair, the other one was vice, and, you know, but mostly Zoller was chair, but
Yeah.
it was still, it was an amazing, and it was not only that, it was in other committees also.
Well, the funny,
Today,
All right,
they
this is
can't
the
get
this is the
along.
last one, and then
Charlie
we have
Zoller was chair of, they kept going back and forth on capital outlay. And Charlie Zoller always had these hearings really early in the morning. And Carol was always complaining, And Charlie says, "Well, yeah, because I know you're still in bed from getting drunk the night before. So I scheduled the hearings early so you won't be there."
So we need to wrap up. I think this has been a great conversation, and Earl, thank you for sharing your insights from our book. Help me to thank them for their time.